All right. Thank you everyone for being here. As Jacob said, my name is Kaity Prieto. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a researcher at The Ohio State University. Today, I'll be sharing with you a little bit about my study, bisexual student identity negotiation. I'll begin with a brief introduction to myself, as researcher positionality inevitably shapes any study. I'll share some brief methodology, go through my findings, a short discussion, and then share what this means for our practice as well as future research. So this again is a narrative study. Narrative inquiries are always strongly autobiographical. My own identity as a bisexual woman struggling with feelings of invisibility and delegitimation, as well as challenges that I've encountered trying to find resources and community on my own campus as an undergrad and still today as a professional working on a college campus led me to this study. The purpose of this narrative study was to understand the experiences of bisexual students relative to their sexual identities and how they negotiate that identity on the college campus. There were 4 research questions that guided this study, which explored not only those identity narratives, but also the way that structures of power informed those experiences. In this study, I use the term bisexual as an inclusive term for those who identify as bi, pan, omni, fluid, queer, among many others. Of course, there are notable distinctions between each of these identities and experiences, each of which is valid on its own. The students who chose to participate in this study all resonated with the umbrella term bisexuality in some way. So in terms of what we know about this student community, much of this will not be news to the folks here, right? Bi plus people comprise the largest segment of the LGBT community and encounter a myriad of systemic forms of oppression. On the college campus, bisexual students are grappling with feelings of invisibility, marginalization, and a hostile campus climate. The fact that they feel invisible and have difficulty accessing resources that are tailored for their particular experiences and needs negatively influences their psychosocial well-being and their academic outcomes. So college administrators, not only should they care about the student community because it's the right thing to do, but they should also be caring because there are very real implications for retention and academic outcomes. Identity negotiation was the construct underlying this study. It refers to the agentic identity work carried out in response to shifting contextual demands, often in response to prejudice. So as students move throughout different environments on and off campus, they're encountering different demands on their identities. They might respond with negation strategies where they try to distance themselves from a stigmatized identity as a source of protection, or they may choose to assert their bisexuality in a variety of ways. And as you'll hear, the students in this study engaged with both of these strategies at varying times. The epistemology underlying this study was critical post-structuralism, which acknowledges the existence of multiple social realities, recognizes that power structures subjectivity, and that resistance is shaped by social forces. So this particular epistemological grounding allowed me to explore the ways that students were able to resist things like monosexism and bisexual erasure, but the way that those agentic moves were also very much constrained by those social forces. Queer theory was the theoretical framework here, which allowed me to explore normativity, including hetero and homonormativity, the way that students performed their identities on campus, and also the way that their bisexuality was often rendered unintelligible because of the liminal nature of that identity. Excuse me. So this was a narrative inquiry, which I chose because it honors participant stories, as well as allows for an analysis of social structures. 16 bi, pan, and or queer students participated in this study. They were all students at one large public research university in the Midwestern United States. They engaged in 2 one-on-one interviews, with the exception of one student who did not return for the second interview. And in between, they had a creative activity where they were able to more privately reflect on their identities and how those showed up across campus contexts. Thematic dialogic performance and deconstructive analyses were used to lead to 7 findings. 2 of which fell into contextual themes that explained the societies in which students were living, and then 5 of which more specifically explored how students were asserting or downplaying their bisexuality. So the first theme, pervasive bi-negativity, essentially was all the things we know about bi-negativity, biphobia, right? Students were told that they were going through a phase, their sexuality wasn't real. Lydia was specifically told the gay community doesn't want you. And this was because Lydia showed up as very traditionally feminine. This was hurtful for her to navigate because her femininity was so critical to her understanding of herself as a Puerto Rican woman. And so she felt like she had to choose in some way. The way that students talked about their bisexuality, they acknowledged that they understood bisexuality as an attraction to multiple genders, more than one gender, certainly more than cis men and women. But the way that they talked throughout our interviews when they were letting their guard down often reinforced this binary language. So they'd use terms like opposite gender relationships, and they'd very intentionally have to correct themselves. And for me, this just emphasizes the way that even for bi folks, the way we understand sexuality and gender is sometimes so socialized into this binary way. In terms of the ways that students negotiated their identity, they would often choose identity labels for the sake of simplicity, like saying they were bi instead of pan, or saying that they were gay instead of some variety of queer. And this was a strategy that reduced the emotional labor that would be needed to explain themselves to others. So this here functioning as a form of protection for students. They also emphasize ways that they did try to push back against by transgressing normative ideas of gender and sexuality. But for the men in the study in particular, they highlighted the ways that they were immediately corrected for these transgressions, which were very painful experiences that may have kept them from doing this moving forward. Similarly, students would assert that their bisexuality doesn't matter so much to them. But it was clear that in spaces where their sexuality was welcomed, they were very excited to talk about it. It was meaningful for them. But by saying that it doesn't matter, this was a way that they were able to cope with bisexual erasure, because they could kind of say, this isn't affecting me that much, even though it was very clearly a painful experience. Students found ways to subtly signal their sexuality to others. So this could be through pride pins and flags, t-shirts, the way they stylize their hair and their bodies, in the hopes that others would catch on and they would be able to build queer community. For most of the students, being out was a way that they could advocate for themselves and others. They hoped that by being unapologetically bi plus, they could make others feel comfortable being the same. This is often what led people to participate in this research study. And for others, just being unapologetically queer was a form of advocating for themselves. So what this all tells me, one is that the role of binaries, even for people that are intentionally pushing back against them, are incredibly strong in our society, right? I also noted throughout the study the role of whiteness, where bisexual students of color felt uniquely erased on campus. But because they were already so highly visible in their racialized bodies, performing queer invisibility functioned as a tool for survival. And so what this all means for practice, we need more inclusive programming and curricula, culturally competent counseling resources, queer faculty and administrators who can serve as role models for our students, and very real funding behind these efforts. It can't just be paying lip service to diversity. And future research should explore a variety of marginalized identities and some that are not so marginalized. For Christian bisexual students, they felt like they had trouble finding a place where both of those identities were highlighted. And so I'm very excited to hear about our next paper. And then lastly, I'm currently working on a study looking at these experiences for graduate students, understanding that the ambiguity of the graduate student role, where you have a student identity, but also a professional identity, might make some of these negotiation strategies even more critical. So thank you so much. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Okay, so I'm Dr. Carol A. Shepherd. You can find me on Twitter at Bi Space Mission. Some of you might know me as the Bi Jumper Woman, which I'm wearing my jumper today in honor of the event. So who am I? I am a social sciences lecturer at the beautifully titled University of the Highlands and Islands in Scotland. I'm also an academic researcher and author and an independent publisher and trade author. And then there's various other facets of my identity there. Academic output, I had a monograph published in 2018 by Palgrave, Bisexuality and the Western Christian Church, The Damage of Silence. Then chapters in books published last year, both Routledge, a chapter on plurisexuality in the church, in bisexuality in Europe, and then looking at the rather dire mental health implications of identifying as bi and Christian in the book on the right. I've also had an autobiography published under the pseudonym of Jamie Summers, who some of you might know is the character name of the Bionic Woman, so Bi Woman, get it? I'll allude to the title in just a little bit. And under my own publishing house, I've published a resource to send to churches to educate them about the mental health implications of ignoring the needs of LGBT youth. And then the book that I published most recently, By the Way, Pastoring Bisexual Christians in Europe, is qualitative research written in a very accessible way with bi Christians around Europe. We all know this infogram. More than half of the LGB community self-identify as bi, so one would expect there to be a lot more stuff out there about bisexual people than gay or lesbian people. My focus is very much on churches, Western Christian Church in particular. Just some little things from the UK. This was a sign stuck on the door of Bradford Cathedral at Easter a couple of years ago. Large northern town in the UK, if you're not from the UK, making the point that everyone is apparently welcome at Bradford Cathedral. I'm not going to read all of that out, but if you look 3 lines from the bottom, and listed amongst the people that are welcome to worship there are homosexuals, lesbians, and transsexuals, irrespective of the fact they have labeled them rather anonymously. They have left out bisexual people entirely, and some other letters as well. This one is particularly shocking. Outcome, which is the LGBT satellite group of the Methodist Church in the UK. If you look at the bottom, it says asterisk LGBTQI is the umbrella term we use to refer to people who describe themselves as lesbian, gay, transgender, queer, or intersex. Yet again, bisexual left out. Your standard LGBT Christian books, we find the same story. Titles such as Gay Theology Without Apology, The Gay Gospels, Queering Christianity. Gay Theology Without Apology, only reference in the index is the only reference in the whole book to bisexuality is in the index, where it says bisexual, see lesbian, gay, bisexual. So you go around in a little loop, you don't actually read anything. The Gay Gospels offers good news for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered people, but they're not even, bisexuality is not mentioned in the contents, and there's no index. Queering Christianity, there's some serious theologians who've been involved in this book. No mention of bisexuality in the index, only a nominal inclusion in the title. And I'm just going to zap to this slide before that one. Is it any different in other world religions? Well, I've looked into Islam. Colleague helped me look into this, a Muslim colleague. Homosexuality in Islam, critical reflection on gay, lesbian, transgender Muslims. Same author, book on the right. Living Out Islam, Voices of Gay, Lesbian and Transgender Muslims. Now, obviously, they maybe couldn't find anyone who was willing to talk. However, all three of these titles would seem to erase bisexuality. In terms of bisexuality in a Christian context in the UK, is still the case that if you're training for ordination in the Church of England, you have to swear your allegiance to this document, Issues in Human Sexuality, 1991, 43 pages. It has 17 pages dedicated to the phenomenon of homosexual love, or homosexuality rather, and within those 17 pages, just one paragraph on bisexuality, in which it, to paraphrase slightly, says, seek a counsellor for your potential personality disorder and stick to your straight side. Simple. And because that paragraph is 119 words, I used that for the title of my autobiography, 119, which talks about how I was thrown out of leadership in the Church of England due to romantic feelings for a woman and not being willing to repent of my bisexual identity. It's very readable, very funny, despite the kind of some of the tragedy within it. So what have I found? My first monograph was compared the experiences of bisexual Christians in the UK and US. I interviewed 54 people with an almost even split, 88% of depressive illness from GAD to suicide ideation. Only found one church in the whole of the UK, MCC North London, that had a bespoke resource on bisexuality. Others ignored it or conflated it with homosexuality. No standalone bisexual Christian support groups. And when I did research for my 2020 book, Pastoring Bisexual Christians in Europe, found 0 churches in any of continental Europe that acknowledged bisexuality in any meaningful way or offered resources. So By the Way was my most recent book, looking at bisexual Christians in Europe. A lot in common with my first book. Nobody heard people talking about bisexuality in a church context except workshops run by myself. One interviewee commented that my talk had been a total game changer and eye-opener. Rather than sermonizing, it was silence that was the dominant experience of bisexual Christians around Europe. I'm not going to read through all this stuff because time won't let me, but just to say that a large number were not openly bisexual because it was seen to be dirty in some way, and it wasn't worth the trouble. Quotes from all over Europe. Again, I'm not going to read all these. This is just to show you that this was throughout Europe. Germany, it's a very painful experience most of the time. I tend to hide it just to fit in. Being gay is cooler. Many girls want to be your best friend. When you're bi, you're kind of a stinky slut people shouldn't trust. This was from a bi guy in Germany. Gonna highlight the quote from Russia here. This was a female Russian. Bisexuals are rarely written about, blah, blah. The average Russian, as a rule, associates bisexuality exclusively with the sphere of sex, insatiability, and promiscuity. So I closed the book, and indeed closed this talk, with pastoral recommendations based on these conversations. Educate yourself about bisexuality. I don't need to tell you guys that, but practically every pastor I spoke to had no idea what bisexuality was and the impacts of it. Don't conflate bisexuality with homosexuality, and please make bespoke resources because the issues are separate. Don't appropriate precious few bisexual role models in scripture for your homosexual cause. This is a big thing in queer theology. Taking characters like David and Jonathan and making them gay icons when there's more than a sniff of bisexuality about them. That's a separate talk for another day. I do the scripture talk as well. Just to scroll down a little bit, what has happened with the emphasis on marriage equality in the church is that it's further entrenched binary monosexual understandings of human sexuality. It doesn't just marginalize bi people, it marginalizes trans, asex, intersex, widowed people, single people, and some disabled people. So it does a massive amount of damage, emphasizing monosexuality over other sexual identities. Don't advise a bisexual person to embrace their straight side. It's not that straightforward. I, for one, am significantly same-sex attracted, and denying those feelings made me very, very ill in my life. And then being advised to dump your same-sex partner and find a straight partner. This was the experience of a lot of people. And just to close, not putting LGBT in the titles of talks, books, resources, if you have no intention of covering bisexuality. It's misleading. It makes people feel rejected, as Kaity was saying, and further stigmatized in the one place they would hope to find support, the LGBT faith community. So that's a bit of a whiz through. These are my links. That's my bisexual jumper. Thank you very much.
Right, well, I don't need that first slide because you've covered that, Jacob. Brilliant. That will save some time if I can get it to go on. There we go. So these are the really familiar images of old age, older people that we used to get all the time. You know, frailty, loneliness, poor health, care homes, imminent death. But actually, in about the last 15, 20 years, there's been a real emphasis that's a reaction to that, that's emphasizing the way that older people can continue to be active and involved in society. It's called the positive or successful aging movement, and it is a really important counter-narrative. So it emphasizes that decline and frailty are not inevitable, or at least they can be significantly reduced by things like continuing physical activity. We have this person touching her toes in the top left, by eating well and drinking well, clearly. Continuing engagement with local and wider communities like LGBT communities or rockers or whatever she is. And it emphasizes the freedoms of retirement, that you've got more time, more leisure, space to do new things. But it does create its own pressures. If you don't keep active, if you don't take up new hobbies, you're failing at aging. And being able to do these things can depend on having good health, enough money, and having grandchildren. It's very normative and it's very neoliberal. It's your responsibility to make sure that you age successfully. It's much easier to age successfully if you're white, well-educated, middle class, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, and so on. Another criticism is that this is just extending midlife. It's not allowing old age to be its own stage with different priorities. An example of this is the way that actually the development of Viagra and similar techniques like that has actually made it much harder for people to say, I don't want to have sex anymore, I'm not that interested in sex, which used to be a kind of unstigmatized thing. It was just natural that you didn't have sex when you were older. But now it's much harder to reject that. So researchers who study aging have argued that we need new, more diverse ways of imagining a good old age, and have suggested that we should particularly learn from minoritized groups like disabled people, Black and minority ethnic people, feminists, and queer people. So I've done previous work looking at feminist visions of a good old age, and Sarah and I have both done previous work on bi aging, so contact us afterwards if you'd like copies of any of those papers. And as a long-time reader of Bi Women Quarterly, I was aware that they'd had a few issues focused on aging. So I thought that would be possibly a really interesting source of ideas about a positive old age, because it's the sort of space where people tell counter-narratives, narratives that don't go along with the normal conventions of how things work. So we looked at these three issues that were published in 2014, 15 and 19. And we asked whether the stories that they told offered any alternatives to the norms of successful aging when talking about later life. When I say positive, we don't necessarily mean happy. We just mean ones that are not the sort of decline and decrepitude storylines. So ones that imagine aging in ways that are hopeful or encouraging or meaningful or purposeful, but are more inclusive of diversity and non-normative life courses than the successful aging narrative. Now, of course, it's hard to tell stories that go against the cultural grain. When we talk, we all draw on the discursive resources that we're used to. So I was interested in the question of, if people do tell alternative stories, how do they manage to do it? What narrative devices do they use? Now, we're still doing the analysis on this. It's fantastic data. I love it so much. So this is just a taster of a couple of things that we can see so far. So I'm just going to whip you through 2 alternative narratives and 2 narrative devices. There are actually lots of alternatives, narratives in terms of talking about continued political engagement, non-traditional family structures, things like that, queer kinship. I'm not actually going to talk about this today, I'm afraid, even though that's a really strong theme, just because I've written about that before and I want to use this space to explore some ideas that I haven't thought about so much. So this is one of them. Nina here is talking about her lesbian grandmother. And of course, the idea of older people as wise and the repository of wisdom that younger people can draw on is in some ways a very traditional idea about later life. That's kind of your most beneficial, your most positive stereotype about old age. But actually, there's nothing about it in the successful aging narrative. In the successful aging narrative, it's all about being as much like midlife as possible. There's no acknowledgement of wisdom or increased knowledge. So I want to argue, although I haven't quite worked this through yet, that this is in its own way an alternative, because it's saying here is something distinctive about being older that is different. Another one of the critiques of successful aging is that it seems to pretend that death is not coming. There seems to be no room for death in a successful later life, which is bizarre. This, I think, is a great counterexample. The author, who's 70 at the time she writes, is musing about what age she wants to die. She's thinking about the life that she wants to live now in the light of looking towards her own death. It's not successful aging in the terms of the normal narrative, because she's living on social security, she's not living independently, but she has a purposeful life doing activities that are meaningful to her. So I think this is a particularly interesting example of an alternative to that successful aging. Speeding on in the interests of time to a couple of the sort of narrative devices that I can see. So in quite a lot of the contributions, people are addressing an imagined younger self or younger generations. So speaking from a position of now being older. And this one in particular, I think, has some really interesting discursive moves in it. It's a very dramatic and poetic account of suffering and living with danger. So there's this first paragraph about her girlfriend and undergoing therapy with a pig, separated, forbidden to meet. And then there's 4 more paragraphs of similar traumatic and distressing experiences. Then there's an account of the freedom of finding queer community and being able to name her experience and all that. And then there's this paragraph that starts, "So forgive me if I've been puzzled by more recent USA LGBTQ politics." It's gone from revolutionary to assimilatist. And then later, when we wanted liberation, not engagement rings. Now we, and then it goes on to what she hopes now. And I think maybe what's going on here is that having suffered like this and having this account of suffering gives her account authority and gravitas. It enables her to make this argument that LGBT politics has become assimilationist. And I think that's a very powerful technique. And finally, telling a story of successful aging, or indeed of decline, is a very tidy narrative. It's clear where the story's going. But several of the accounts in these 3 issues are not tidy. They're a bit dreamlike or poetic or inconclusive. The prefatory note about this author tells us that she's 70 in poor health and living in an intentional community. And the piece is a kind of meditation on what this means. And it's particularly poetic towards the end of this, where this is the final few sentences, and she sort of invokes these someones. Someone is afraid, someone can only afford, someone lives, and it's a lovely diverse range of images and invocations of different people. And I think particularly in that last 2 paragraph, there's no closure. There's no what's going to happen. It's just this sort of mysterious underground springs and the ghosts, maybe a little bit of queer kinship in the ghosts, I don't know, and the ancestors leaving cautionary messages. So it's not closed down. It's not, here is the answer, here is what it means to be bi and older. And I think that's really, very unusual and radical and interesting, and is part of why this is such great data that I'm having so much fun with. Some very obvious conclusions. Yep, they do tell stories. To be honest, before I looked, I knew they would do, because I know what BWQ is like. And they do use some different, a range of different narrative devices to enable them to do that. We're still working on the paper, but when it comes out, Sarah and I will tweet it. So do follow us on Twitter, or do look out for that on Twitter. And thank you very much.